Now I'd like to introduce Jennifer, who's waiting patiently. Jennifer serves as the Chief Historic Sites Officer for the Ohio History Connection, overseeing the care, management, and public interpretation of the state's 50-plus historic sites and museums. Jennifer has also served since 2016 as Project Director for the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks World Heritage Inscription Projects. She holds an MA in Anthropology from the University of Virginia, where she was as an archaeologist with a specialty in landscape culture contact in Eastern North America. Before that, she was a curator of archaeological collection at Thomas Jefferson Monticello, which is also on the UNESCO World Heritage list. She's also worked as an instructor at the University of Virginia and Otterbein University. She is an Ohioan by birth and is glad to be bringing awareness to Ohio's amazing American Indian heritage. She comes to us today from Columbus, Ohio. Ladies and gentlemen, Jennifer Aultman. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's always a joy. The best part of my job, I always say, is getting to talk about our sites and the World Heritage Project. And well, the worst part, I do a lot of budgeting and, staff stuff, which I love. We have a tremendous staff. They work all over the state. So I love to just start very briefly by telling you about Ohio History Connection, because we're sort of an enigmatic organization. We're a 501c3 organization, but we are the state's nonprofit history partner. Many states have a state agency that manages their historic resources, but in Ohio, it's the 501c3. And we have existed since 1885, so a very long time. Excuse me. And our first site, which was actually the state's really sort of first state park, is one of the 8 sites I'll really be talking about today, and that's Fort Ancient in Warren County. And we took over that site and started to accumulate property and try to preserve the earthworks there starting in 1891. So I've been doing the work for a really long time. I personally have been with the Ohio History Connection for about 7.5 years, and I had really the great privilege to be hired on to work on this World Heritage Project. So I encourage you to visit all of our sites. You're going to learn a lot about a few of them today. I have some information in the back about these sites, but also about all of Ohio History Connection sites and membership, and we would love to welcome you to any of them. So thanks again for having me here. But today, I get to talk to you about the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks. And this is a long-term project and really a labor of love for so many people. Some of them staff at Ohio History Connection and the National Park Service, but also citizens across Ohio who really came together. And in a wonderful way, we also have partnerships with tribal nations, tribes that historically lived here in Ohio, but were removed, and they are part of this project too. So I like to start, and I'm going to unfortunately walk in front of it to advance my slides some. I like to start with the people. So the wonderful thing about the earthworks here in Ohio is that they're gathering places. There are a lot of things we don't know about them, but what we do know is that they are places that people came to from near and far to be together for lots of important reasons. And they're still doing that today. The earthworks are still bringing people together today. And so just to give you a sense of some of the folks who've been really involved here in the project recently, as I say, the earthworks connect people, the earth, and the cosmos across space and time. So those are the things I'll share with you today. And so just starting over on the left, we have Chief Glenna Wallace of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, Josh Garcia of the Wyandotte Nation, Diane Hunter of Miami Nation. Then in this central photo, is Joe Stallman on the left of the Seneca Nation. There's Josh again, the tall guy in the back. Kevin Pape is a preservationist in Cincinnati. Chief Glenna again. And then in the red blazer is my CEO, our CEO at Ohio History Connection, Megan Wood. And then the guy in the blue suit who looks like he owns the place there, he does. That's the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, because we were in Riyadh when this photo was taken. And I'll get to that part of the story here in a few minutes. And then we have my National Park Service colleagues, Chris Alford and Brett Ruby, Alex Weesaw from Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, and then Logan York from the Miami Nation, Brad Lepper, who's our senior archaeologist for our World Heritage program. And if you've done much reading on Ohio archaeology at all, you have probably read Brad's work. He's been working on Ohio archaeology and the earthworks for over 30 years. And then there's me. And on this side over here, again, some of the same people, but this is out at Serpent Earthworks in Bainbridge, Ohio. So near Chillicothe. Serpent is one of the 8 sites that's part of this World Heritage property. So I like to get people's faces in your minds, and then we'll back up and kind of start the story from the beginning. And that is, what's World Heritage and why is it a big deal? We love to quote Governor DeWine in his inaugural speech, his second one. He said, and I quote, "World Heritage is a big deal." So why did he say that? Well, World Heritage is a program of UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And it's really a simple idea. It's very similar to our National Park Service idea here in the US, and that is to preserve and share natural and cultural places that have great significance. And the language we use in World Heritage terms is that certain places on Earth are of outstanding universal value and should therefore form part of the common heritage of humankind. So World Heritage nerds, we talk about OUV all the time, and that's that outstanding universal value. That's the significance of those sites. So places like the pyramids, Machu Picchu, the Acropolis, the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks in Ohio, that these are all places that if they were lost, maybe I'll say it in a negative way here, if they were lost, there's a sense that humanity would have lost something collectively. Not just, the people who live in that town or that country, but all of us. And I often think about this in relation to Notre Dame when it was burning a few years ago, and people all over the world were riveted and watching and just hoping that the whole thing wasn't going to collapse. Because I think we all felt like we would collectively have lost something. So that's kind of the idea behind World Heritage, and it really had its origins in the World Wars, when particularly in Europe, people were watching important cultural heritage places be destroyed in front of their eyes. So it took until the early 1970s for the World Heritage Convention to actually be written. The United States was very supportive. The Nixon administration really championed World Heritage, and we were the first country to ratify. So today, excuse me, there are almost 2,000 World Heritage sites across the globe. There's about 190 countries that have signed on to the World Heritage Convention, so it's an international treaty. And we now have one World Heritage property in Ohio. So I'll talk about 8 sites, and then I say there's one, and so that's confusing. And the reason is that from a World Heritage point of view, all 8 of these Ohio sites are one World Heritage property. They all tell a part of a single story. So that's why we get counted as one in World Heritage terms, but there are 8 components. And you'll see it's a little hard to see on here, but Western Europe, lots and lots and lots of World Heritage sites. Southeast Asia, lots of World Heritage sites. Actually, Central America, it's a lot of World Heritage sites. And there's a real effort in the last few years to add underrepresented types of sites to the list. And indigenous sites are one of those identified as being underrepresented. So these earthworks in Ohio, being American Indian places, feel very proud to have contributed to the list by adding these indigenous sites to them. And then here in the US, So again, this is the 25th World Heritage property, but here are some others. So the Grand Canyon, that doesn't surprise people, and yet when you go there, everyone just thinks of it as a National Park Service site. Very few people think about World Heritage, but it is a natural World Heritage site. And then San Antonio Missions, I add that because it's sort of similar in that it's a group of many mission sites that are one World Heritage property. They were added in 2015. The Alamo is one of those, but interestingly, it's actually the early history of the Alamo, the mission period. That's why it's on the World Heritage list, not its later history. And then Poverty Point, Louisiana, and Cahokia, Illinois. Has anybody ever been to either of those? I'm just curious. Yeah, you have. Yeah. Well, I know you have. You went with me. That's right. He was the driver. Actually, he probably was the driver. We do trade driving sometimes, I promise. Which have you been to? Cahokia. Cahokia. Okay. So I put those on here because they are also American Indian earthworks, but they are very different from the earthworks here in Ohio. Poverty Point in Louisiana is quite a bit older, a couple thousand years older than the earthworks here. And then Cahokia is about 1,000 years younger. So the Hopewell Ceremonial earthworks really fill in, at least partially fill in, this sort of gap in the US's World Heritage sites because there's a long tradition of earthwork building among many American Indian tribes. And so they fit right in between those two. Very different. Cahokia was a place where there were, I'm going to be an archaeologist here for a second. There was great social hierarchy at Cahokia. There were elites. They got better food. They did less work. I mean, they lived a different life from common people, and they lived on top of these platform mounds. So that's a different kind of building with earth than the earthworks I'm going to talk about today, which are different yet again from Poverty Point, which was probably a big trading center, but there's a lot to learn yet about Poverty Point as well. So where are these places? These are the 8 Hopewell Ceremonial earthworks. They are, I don't know why, but we always go from east to west whenever we talk about them, so that's what I'm going to do. Ohio History Connection has the Newark earthworks, so that's one of our sites. We've had those since 1933, and 2 parts of the Newark earthworks, the Octagon and the Great Circle, are part of this World Heritage property. And then the National Park Service has 5 sites in the Chillicothe area. Those are 5 of the 8. And then Fort Ancient Earthworks in southwest Ohio, in Warren County, that is the 8th. We were there yesterday, so we've been all over last couple days. And people often ask, okay, Fort Ancient, like I know where Chillicothe is, I know where Newark is, where is Fort Ancient? If you ever are on 71 headed towards Cincinnati, and you go over the very large Jeremiah Morrow Bridge. Everyone's always impressed by the large bridge over the Little Miami. And you're headed south, look to the left, and you're looking at Fort Ancient. It's right there just north of Kings Island. So, and something I like to point out while I have this topographic map open, I'm a landscape nerd. So I really love to think about how the sites are situated. And you start to think about ancient people and how they were deciding where to put them. So you'll notice this is the Muskingum River Valley here. It comes up here, and then the Licking River is a tributary. So the Newark earthworks, they are a tributary to the Muskingum, which goes to the Ohio. Then all these sites along the Scioto River, I mean, that's obviously a tributary to the Ohio. And then Fort Ancient's on the Little Miami, so the Great Miami's over there. So you can actually, if the water was high enough, you could take a canoe or today a kayak, and you could navigate from one to the other. So we think about how the rivers were important. They were transportation. They were, central way that people communicated. And the fact that these large ceremonial sites were right on the rivers is not accidental. That was a really important feature of where they were. And also, kind of interestingly, most of these sites are located right where the glaciated part of Ohio and the unglaciated part meet, right? You can see that on the topography. That's also not accidental. And I could go down a lot of rabbit holes about this, but I'll just say that has one of the upshots that has is that most of the sites are located on Pleistocene gravel terraces. So you've got today's rivers and they look really small. If you've ever been in Chillicothe, the river valleys are these huge, wide river valleys, and they're these tiny, I mean, even the Scioto's not a giant river, these small rivers and creeks. And that's because at the end of the glacial period, the Taze Valley, which was this giant river, ran through there. And so it carved a huge valley. And today we only have small rivers left. But what it did was leave behind a lot of gravel. And so these sites aren't in today's floodplains. They sit up above them on top of glacial gravels. And so they don't flood. They're near rivers. It's easy to access the rivers, but they're never underwater. So it's just kind of interesting to think about how people were making decisions. They're also nice flat areas, which is really important for reasons we'll get into. I'd like to share this map, which shows in 1914, there was a great effort made to map where Ohio's mounds and earthworks were. And this shows what Mills was able to record with a lot of help from a lot of people around Ohio. So mounds and earthworks aren't only in southern and central Ohio. There are some in northern Ohio. But here you can even see right along, so that's Licking County, that's the Newark Earthworks is there, along the Scioto, and then to the west along the Miami and its tributaries. So there were over 10,000 mounds. So by mounds, I mean just an individual, usually conically shaped mound, and several hundred earthen enclosures or earthworks. Sometimes those mounds are inside earthworks, sometimes they're independent of each other. But many of these places you can't see today. Many of them were completely destroyed by plowing and city building and all of that. We do have some new techniques in archaeology the last 20 or 30 years that are helping us find some that we thought were completely gone using archaeological geophysics, but you can actually see the part that's still there. So starting to regain some of them, at least knowing exactly where they were, but we've lost a lot. So the Hopewell culture, right? These are the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks. The Hopewell culture is what I would call an archaeologically defined culture. So that means archaeologists look at objects and artifacts, we look at how people were living, we look at the earthworks they were building and how they were building them, and say, okay, all of this is interrelated. And so we call that a culture. It was given the name the Hopewell culture a long time ago, and that's not an American Indian word. This is something we've dealt with along the way. Hopewell is the name of a landowner. Archaeologists tend to name sites after the person who owns the land. So Mordecai Cloud Hopewell, he was a Civil War veteran, lived in the Chillicothe area, and had owned the property where one of, what we would call the diagnostic site, the type site, was located. So it just means a guy owned a property and had a really big site on it. And archaeologists named that pattern of living after him. And that has problems, right? That has problems today. So we often explain that because we don't want anyone to think that the term Hopewell is the name of a tribe. We work with tribes almost every day and consult with them all the time. And in writing this World Heritage nomination, one of the things they said to us was, please don't talk about Hopewell people. You can talk about Hopewell earthworks if you have to, because that's, it's a certain pattern of earthwork building, but please don't say Hopewell people, because that's not a word that meant anything to them. And so we'll sometimes say the people of the Hopewell culture or the earthwork builders. So you might hear me use some terms that sound a little bit circuitous sometimes. And that's because I don't want to use the term Hopewell Hopewell people, because that wasn't their name. And so that begs the question, well, what did they call themselves? And of course, we don't know the answer. Most, or at least many tribes, their name is just their word for people, right? So the name of the tribe is just, that's were the people. And so the Hopewell culture probably is ancestral to many, many, many of today's tribes. So you can't draw a straight line between any one tribe and the people that built the earthworks here nearly 2,000 years ago. And I'll give you a little bit of evidence for why we think that's the case. But a really essential feature of Hopewell earthworks is that many of them are geometric earthworks. And I'll go into a little bit of detail on that geometry here in a minute. But they're huge, 2/3 of a mile across, earthworks that enclose 50 acres. The Octagon in Newark is 50 acres, and then the circle it's attached to is 20 acres. So they're really big. And that leads me to ask, who has been to the Newark earthworks or the earthworks in Chillicothe? Yeah, a handful of people. And I think one of the things when you visit them is they're so big that you can't perceive the whole thing on the ground, right? You can't really see the shape. So we know that they were using math and surveying techniques to lay them out. Because if I wanted to draw a small circle here on the ground, I could do that pretty well just eyeballing it. But I can't make a circle 1,200 feet across just by eyeballing it. So they were really working together using surveying and knowledge of math. And then the second type of earthworks that we see commonly, that we call Hopewell earthworks, are these hilltop enclosures. So this is a rendering of Fort Ancient. And if I said there's a lot of really interesting geometry at Fort Ancient, you might look at that and say, where? Because that just looks like, somebody decided to outline this hilltop. Well, that's exactly what they did. They flattened it. So they sort of artificially flattened this whole plateau that was already pretty flat. And they built earthworks all along the outside edge of it. 3.5 miles of them. And the way these earthworks were built, and this is the part that's easy to gloss over, but if you really think about it, it's mind-blowing. They built these earthworks with hose that were made of a stick with a clamshell or a stick with a deer scapula and a basket about this big. Millions and millions and millions and millions of times. And these were community building projects. They were not, no one was being forced, as best we can tell. Unlike Cahokia, where you had a leader who didn't work hard and got all the best food, everybody in this society, from what we can tell, they were eating the same things. Everybody was working just as hard as everybody else. And that they were cooperatively and communally building. So people from near and far coming together. I often think of, we have 3 children, and I think of like trying to get children to help with something like this, right? A community project, what did that look like? So Fort Ancient was not built overnight. It was built over a few hundred years, but some of the earthworks were probably built in a couple of seasons. We don't know because we're still working on how to best date earthworks. They're kind of complicated to get real specific dates on. But they are really, truly remarkable places. And you just think about, why do people do things like this? Why would people spend so much effort to build these earthworks? And, I think the answer for anything, like any monumental building project like that, is because it mattered. It mattered so much. It was sort of tied to their existential understanding of who they were. I mean, you think of all the, cathedrals in Europe, or you think of, you can think of all of these other World Heritage sites too. A place like Stonehenge. Why did people do that? Well, because it mattered. And we have some idea why it mattered so much, but we don't know all the details, and frankly, we never will. So I want to just take a quick pause there, because I'm going to talk about some specifics about why they're on the World Heritage List. And it has to do with the astronomy and geometry. And how far people were coming from to be at these sites. But I want to just stop and see if you have any specific questions so far about the stuff I've covered. Yes?
These were different tribes building this. Have any idea how many different tribes there were, say in Ohio?
Yeah, it's a great question. So these were different tribes probably coming together. Do we know how many tribes were in Ohio? We don't. And it's really a complicated question, because when you look at how tribes see themselves, like there are clans within tribes and there are different lineages within tribes. And in many cases, because I'm a colonial period sort of nerd, many times tribes' names, they had to kind of solidify their names in the colonial period because everyone was asking, what's your tribe? What's your tribe? What's the name? When you might have had groups of people that understood they were kind of interrelated, but they might have actually called themselves different names. So it also begs the question, what's a tribe? So I'm not trying to evade your question. It's actually a really great and complicated question. And so we don't have a number. But I'm going to show a slide in a minute that will show you some of the geographic connections that will give you a sense, I think, of how far people might have come from. So yeah, great question.
Would these
Yeah.
be a religious thing that they built these things on?
Yeah, that is a little bit of where I was going to go next. So would this be religious? So yes, this is why we call them ceremonial earthworks. Religious, spiritual, communal. I think those words mean certain things in our modern world that maybe don't like transfer back 2,000 years perfectly, but they are certainly, if I had to describe it in kind of modern terms, I would say these practices and the earthwork building and all the things that went with it, they were probably part of a spiritual movement that covered almost 2/3 of North America. So if you think about something, modern analogs are not perfect, but if you think about like being in Italy, and so a Catholic person might go to Italy and walk into a mass, and they could be from, I don't know, some other country. They could be from South America. And they could go into a mass in Italy, and it might be a little bit different, but like there are things they are going to recognize, right? So it was probably a little bit like that, like some common beliefs and common practices, even when there was variation, across long distances. So yes. Yeah. Yes.
How is it that these were preserved?
Mm-hmm.
A burial ground here in our county that was totally
Mm-hmm.
demolished by a university.
Yeah.
And taken away. And then I saw during the Civilian Conservation Corps,
Mm-hmm.
there had been picnic grounds around some of these. And one of the things they did was clear that away. So I got this all.
Great question. So how did these end up being preserved? The interesting thing about these 8 sites is they're all sort of at different stages of preservation. They all look really similar today. But for example, this right here is the Great Circle in Newark and Heath, Ohio. It's beautiful today. The center is cleared out. It's a beautiful grassy place. Well, this was the Licking County Fairgrounds, and it was actually the Ohio State Fair one year. There was a racetrack inside of the Great Circle. There were bleachers. There had been, a reunion of Civil War veterans here. I mean, that had like 20,000 people at it. So in some cases, but fortunately the earthworks were not really touched by all of that. So in that case, that was a case of a community recognizing that this was a special place. They tried to figure out something to do with it that would, keep people from wanting to plow that land. So they turned it into a fairground. At the Octagon Earthworks, the idea there was, well, let's put the Ohio Militia encampment there. So the Octagon in the early 1900s is where the Ohio Militia, or essentially the National Guard, was for several years. Fort Ancient, which I mentioned we've took into our site system in 1891 as our first site, that was a place that people just, for whatever reason, that one's kind of an interesting story in that people just felt like it had to be preserved. That's one that people love to picnic at. So Fort Ancient now, we probably have, 25 or 30,000 visitors a year right now. There was a time about 100 years ago when it had 100,000 visitors a year because people would go and picnic at Fort Ancient. So they all have kind of different preservation stories, but it was a time period in the late 19th century and the late 1800s when people were in Ohio were very interested in earthworks. Were looking for ways to preserve them, even at the same time that people were still trying to understand who built them and exactly what they were. So yeah, great question. Chillicothe, Mound City, that was Camp Sherman, World War I camp, and several of the mounds there were actually leveled. The archaeologists did manage to save a couple. And so at Mound City, some of them have been restored. They are restored exactly in place. But again, complicated preservation histories. Yeah. Yes.
I was saying the mounds are burial sites, but earthworks aren't.
Right. Yes. So I make the distinction between mounds and earthworks because to me they are, and I'm not the only one, they are different. So mounds quite often in Ohio have burials in them. They're burial mounds. Some, like at Mound City in Chillicothe, some of those were burial mounds where people were buried, and some of them were mounds where ceremonial objects were essentially buried. So instead of people, you have a big deposit of, mica or obsidian or, huge ceremonial obsidian spear points. But mounds seem to be places where people are marking and creating a memory, right? It's like a memory place. Earthworks are kind of like architecture. It's sort of like, you could see that here at the Great Circle, like these walls around the Great Circle. What happened inside was sort of sacred and spiritual and communal. And so we don't find any houses, no everyday houses inside of these large earthworks. They were all outside. So they really are like defining the space, right? The sacred and the everyday, the inside and the outside. So that's why I make that distinction in my language, just because I'm trying to, be precise. Great questions. So I should say then, the World Heritage list, there are like 10 criteria, and you have to make the case for at least one to add sites to the World Heritage list. We made the case for these two, and they both passed, yay. The committee agreed that they were both appropriate, so that these are masterpieces of human creative genius, and that's all about astronomical alignments that I'll just give you a brief glimpse into, and the geometry, and that they bear unique or exceptional testimony to the cultural tradition that made them. Meaning, if you can understand something about these sites, you start to understand something about the worldview of the people and what mattered to them. Okay, so masterpiece of human creative genius. So this is the Octagon Earthworks in Newark, and you'll see it's really an octagon attached to a circle. And the entire site appears to be aligned to an 18.6-year cycle of the moon. Is anybody aware of the 18.6-year cycle of the moon? Yeah, it's not really something well, okay. Yes. I should make him come up and explain it and see how he does, right? Yeah.
Brought a ringer in.
That's that. He's not just a driver and a tech guy. So the 18.6-year cycle of the moon is about where the moon rises and sets. And it's very subtle. So the moon, the angle between where it rises and where it sets changes over time. So it's close together, and then over 9.3 years, it gets wider and wider apart. So rises here and sets here. And then over the next, 9.3 years, it goes back close together. And that basically creates these points. I won't dive too deep into that, but I want to point out one of them specifically, which is the maximum northern moonrise. You see the one that runs straight down the circle and all the way across the octagon there? Excuse me, I'll grab my water while I'm over here. That one. That maximum northern moonrise, the entire site is aligned to that. They clearly intended that every 18.6 years when the moon rose, it came up across this entire complex. So a lot of people are familiar with summer and winter solstice alignments, places like Stonehenge, the sun dagger out west. This is a lunar alignment. And there are other societies that know about the 18.6-year cycle of the moon, but it's not very common to build sites. I mean around the world in human history, it's not very common to build this into sites, this archaeoastronomical alignment. And it's not only at the Newark Earthworks, this is just where it's clearest. It is at a couple of other sites. Fort Ancient actually has it in a subtle way. High Bank Works in Chillicothe is also a circle and octagon. They're just turned 90 degrees, so the alignment is different there, but it still works. And so people from all over the world travel to places like Stonehenge, right? They want to be there on that day when that thing happens. Well, that same kind of thing was happening here. And we are actually in the period of time where that northernmost alignment is happening. So, yes.
So if these are laid out the same way, did some of the same people lay them out? Because we haven't discussed the different tribes.
Yeah, it's a great question. So if they're laid out the same way, was it some of the same people laying them out? And this is the interesting question, right? It's like, there doesn't seem to have been one person who was telling everybody how to do this. And so I've had some really interesting conversations with tribal partners about, there are societies, and many of the tribes that are here in the United States sort of function this way, where there are clans or groups within the tribe that hold special knowledge. And so, it's possible that a certain clan in this tribe was responsible for knowing how to, maybe lay them out, and I'm sort of being speculative here, but it doesn't seem like it was one person like with a set of plans, but that the knowledge was held sort of collectively, which is just a very different way than we do things today. Yeah. Yes.
What span of years are we talking about? I saw it on the previous slide, but I didn't.
Yeah, you didn't internalize it because I'm going fast. Yeah, they were from about AD 1 to 400 or so that they were built. And then probably used for a while after that, but that was the main period. So this is just another example of some of that sort of sacred knowledge. This is 1,054 feet. So if you go from chunked a square into here, basically each side would be 1,054 feet, which is actually how we think they built the octagons. They probably laid out a square and then kind of pushed out the corners. And then this circle is 1,054 feet across. That great circle down there, that's 1,200 feet across, the one at the bottom of that map. And these are two measurements we find over and over and over again at multiple sites. So we don't know why these numbers matter. I can't tell you. I mean, they certainly weren't measuring in feet, so 1,054 isn't like a magical number, or 1,200. But that distance mattered because they made circles of the exact same size over 100 miles, right? 200 miles. So one might be over here, and then 50 miles this way, you got another circle same size, which is just fascinating, right? That's how we know these weren't independent groups that didn't have anything to do with each other. It was all part of a practice or a belief system where even the measurements mattered. And then I'll move real fast through these. There are things like the area of that circle is equal to the area of that square, and it moved a little bit there. I have to fix that. And the perimeter of that square is equal to the circumference of that circle. So there's all this hidden math in them too. And there are more layers, but the fact, I think the thing that's interesting is that probably every person who came to these sites or worked on them, probably not everyone knew all of the sort of secret math that was involved, but that certain groups of people, who were like spiritual leaders or ceremonial leaders, somebody knew that it was important to build it this way. It's sort of like, again, a cathedral example, like all the cruciform, the cross-shaped cathedrals, that mattered because it's symbolically important. Well, this is probably a similar kind of thing. Okay, and then real quick, so I've talked about earthworks and not at all about timber buildings. That's because when you visit the sites today, what you will see are the earthworks. But there were huge timber structures inside of some of these earthworks, and we're learning more and more about them all the time, especially down in the Chillicothe area with some of the great research they're doing. So this is a rendering. At the Great Circle in Newark, there's a mound in the middle, and in the 1920s, Emerson Greenman, archaeologists, did excavations there and found post molds. So you can tell where a post rots in the ground or where somebody pulls it and then it gets filled in. And this is what we think the building looked like. It was a big timber building. It was a ceremonial building. It was not a house. And many of the other sites have this too. So again, just more evidence. These were ceremonial places. They were communal places, remarkable, big, huge timber buildings. Lots of people potentially gathered in them. We see burned areas that they were sort of altars where objects were burned, where people were cremated. They were just incredibly important places. And then this map is really helpful in understanding that this was a large movement. It wasn't just any single tribe. So these are some of the objects that came into Ohio and where they came from. Grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountains, huge obsidian spear points. They're this big. They were never used. They're just ceremonial. And that obsidian has been chemically sourced to Yellowstone National Park, Obsidian Cliffs in Yellowstone. Like 2,000 miles. Why would you bring dozens and dozens and dozens of pieces of obsidian this big all of that way? Unless it was just so important. Copper from southern Canada, shell, clearly not from Ohio. It's not Ohio shell. It's not freshwater shell. It's marine shell. And so people and things were coming from across 2/3 of North America. And they were leaving these things in the Ohio River Valley, burying them, oftentimes in mounds. And then you ask yourself, well, what were they leaving with, And we think the answer is they were leaving with experiences and relationships and spiritual significance, and that making the journey mattered, and being there together with other people who were part of the same thing really mattered to them. So that's what I wanted to share about the sites, and I'll just talk real briefly about the World Heritage process, and I'm really happy to answer questions if anybody has them. Yes?
Before we go on.
Yeah.
Could part of the reason they brought those things there was in trade?
That,
Particularly, I'm thinking of Flint.
yeah, that's a great question. Could people have brought that stuff there for trade, particularly for flint? Excuse me. I have a chronic cough, and after I talk for a while, it kicks in, so then I gotta drink my water. I told my husband I'd make him start talking when this happens. Yeah, that's right. So when I started in grad school, it was in the 90s, everybody talked about the Hopewell interaction sphere. And they talked about it like a trade system. Symbolic, but also trade. The trick of it is, can't find anything going the other way. There's not like a ton of flint going the other way. So stuff is coming in and nothing equivalent is going out. So you're right in that flint, these very small flint bladelets, they're about this big and about this wide, and they're usually curved. We do find those sometimes going the other direction. And so you kind of left with two conclusions as an archaeologist. Either what was going the other way was perishable, right? And we just don't find it. Or what was going the other way was intangible, right? And that these tiny little bladelets, mostly made of flint ridge flint, or a lot of them anyway, that they might have been like a token. You know, people go on a religious pilgrimage today. You think of like the Hajj, people going to Mecca, right? What they leave with is something that can't be touched. So that's more the way that our thinking has gone today. Always open in archaeology and science that we'll have some understanding in the future that's different from that. But that's the best way we understand it now. Yes.
Thinking about, are they to the greater Ohio area, or do you find them elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a good question. Are these unique to the Ohio area, these earthworks and mounds, or do we find them other places? So they do go out further into the Midwest, to Indiana, to Illinois. Excuse me. There are a fair number actually in Kentucky and West Virginia along the Ohio River. And there is Hopewell connection as far south as northern Florida. But this is clearly the center, just in terms of the sheer number and the volume of materials. And so, yeah, so this is what we might call the Hopewell heartland.
I was wondering, is this kind of like a Mecca example? Is Ohio kind of a pilgrimage site for a large?
I mean,
Go Bucks.
right? we do sometimes say the heart of it all for 2,000 years, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that is our best model today. The big question is, were people who lived, you know, in the Rocky Mountains, were they coming here, or were people from here going to the Rocky Mountains and getting stuff and bringing it back? I'm not sure we've really answered that question, but gosh, it sure seems like people were coming from pretty far, whatever that means. Yeah, the influence was far. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, yes.
Is the Serpent Mound part of this also?
Great question.
I know the egg, how big is the egg? Could that have had ceremonies in it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Serpent Mound, is that part of this? It is not, because Serpent Mound is from a different time period. So when you make the case for World Heritage, and it has to be this really tight case and all the sites have to be interconnected. Serpent Mound, early on, they actually were wondering about that. It just didn't fit. Serpent Mound is probably about 1,000 years younger than these. There's actually a scholarly debate about its exact age because earthworks are hard to date. So anyway, and it is different. It is actually much smaller. It is what we call an effigy mound. There are other effigy mounds in the Midwest. We have just a couple of other ones in Ohio. So Serpent Mound is on the United States tentative list to potentially be a World Heritage Site in the future, but it is not part of this nomination. And probably what would happen is someday we would work with the Park Service and other partners to put several effigy mounds together to tell a bigger story and then propose that for World Heritage, hopefully someday. Yeah.
What about the mounds in the south, like Mississippi and Georgia? I believe there's quite a few mounds.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of the mounds that are further to the south are later. So you have both burial mounds to the south, like in Virginia, where I was for 15 years, there were burial mounds in central Virginia. And then you also have like the platform mounds or Mississippi, and they're more like Cahokia. So again, they're about 1,000 years earlier. They might be about the same age as Serpent Mound, actually. So mound building traditions are very long-standing in the Eastern Woodlands, and they're different types. What's that?
1,000 years earlier or later?
1,000 years later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. 1,000 years later. So around 1,000 to 1,300. So, yep.
Question.
Yes.
So these 2,000 years,
Mhm.
if I don't mow my yard for 2,000 years, it's all gonna be, I'm
Yeah.
gonna see these things.
Yeah.
I show up in Ohio, I'm a settler in the
Yep.
1800s, I'm gonna go,
Mhm.
I bought this land, I'm gonna plow it,
Mhm.
is this like this big hill in the way, or is it covered up, or can I see this? Or how I put that?
Yeah, great question. Trees, I mean, everything's grown up. So at the time, 2,000 years ago, people were probably burning. American Indian people were doing a lot of land management. It wasn't a sort of empty wilderness. There was a lot of land management going on. They probably burned these places to clear them and keep them clear. And then, they had become overgrown over the course of, like 1,500 years. And so that was common, that European American people came in, settlers, get a piece of land, and then would start discovering these things. So there was a real interest, and this is where some of my academic histories collide, but people like Thomas Jefferson about the mounds and what they were and who built them. So especially as the Ohio country was getting settled and the just density, the sheer number of mounds here. Like Jefferson himself was interested in that question. And so it was through land clearing, people would realize, oh, there is something here. We don't know what it is. There were all kinds of theories that it was a lost tribes of Israel, that it was, all these other things besides American Indians. And what we've come to learn in the decades since is no, American Indian people built these. Like the obvious explanation is the explanation. But yeah, many of them were just discovered the way you described. They were completely overgrown. And it was just people coming in and clearing them. And what we do know is that some mounds and earthworks were known by native people. So I'm going to give an example from Virginia, where there had been large burial mounds, much like Adena mounds, but they were used up into, the probably 1600s. Thomas Jefferson himself talked in Notes on the State of Virginia about people, American Indian people, going straight to them and doing what he construed to be mourning, and then going back on their way. So these were places in living memory of American Indian people, even though they maybe weren't actively being used. Okay, so quickly, because, I can go on for a long time about this stuff. Our timeline to get to World Heritage. So in 2008, these earthworks were added to the United States tentative list, like at the same time as Serpent Mound, that they might become World Heritage sites in the future. And then for about 10 years, it was just a group of staff at Ohio History Connection and the Park Service and concerned citizens, people like former First Lady Hope Taft. She's a great advocate in our group, who helped move the idea of World Heritage along. And you work with the federal government. It's the National Park Service's Office of International Affairs in Washington, D.C. that runs this program. So you go back and forth with them about preparing the nomination. And so that work took about 10 years. And then in 2018, Department of the Interior issued a formal invitation to go ahead and prepare our nomination. And then, as certain family members of mine can attest, there were 3 very intense years of preparing the nomination itself. And I will show it to you. Happy to pass it around. So this is 332 pages. This is what we submitted to the World Heritage Committee. It took several years to put together, and behind it we have thousands and thousands of pages of documentation, management plans, and just all the things, because what they care about is the sites are important, they have outstanding universal value, and they're well protected and well managed. They won't add sites to the World Heritage list if they're not going to be protected and well managed. So that is what we put together. So I can pass it, I guess, if you have any interest in taking a peek. And then it was evaluated for about 1.5 years. That's actually, we had on-site evaluations. That's an international evaluator there taking notes. We were with him for a week, took him from site to site. And then on September 19th of 2023, the World Heritage Committee met that week in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. So several of us went to Riyadh, and we were there for the vote, which was sort of surreal. It was surreal to be in Riyadh, but also surreal to think that all these many years of people's work had brought these Ohio earthworks to international attention. And so we just continue to try to do our best in managing them and getting the word out and working with tribal partners. And hopefully you'll see over the years as you visit that we have more and more engagement with tribal people telling their own histories alongside of, our staff. We also do have tribal staff. So just continuing to build them and share them with the world to build the story. I have links. I won't make you watch the videos, but they are online if you want to see what it looks like to have a site voted on for World Heritage. And then this is in the back of the room, the World Heritage meetings right after the vote had happened. That's why there's so many big grins in this photo. Some of the same people that you saw in the earlier photos are there. And the folks on the right are from DC, the Office of International Affairs. Again, they work with all the US World Heritage sites, and we stay in close contact. So, you know, I think one of the things you're thinking about is, well, gosh, we got that. What's next? But here's the really great thing about the earthworks here in Ohio is that, like, if you think back to that map I showed you with all the red dots, the Mills map, the earthworks, there are many, many, many of them that are still preserved. They're not all in Ohio History Connection's hands or stewardship or the National Park Service, but sometimes in city parks, all kinds of different owners, nonprofit organizations, land trusts. And so when we think about, like, you can visit all three of these in one day, you don't see much, you kind of run in, run out. And so we'd really like to develop this kind of driving trail and then maybe someday a walking and biking trail, maybe, fingers crossed, where people can really take their time and go from one site to the other. And the great thing is there's so much wonderful Ohio culture from other time periods. There are other earthworks to see. Lots of wonderful Appalachian culture and music and food in this part of Ohio. So really working together with many, many communities to welcome visitors from Ohio and from around the US and frankly from around the globe, to not just learn about the earthworks, which is of course the primary focus, but also just to experience, you know, beautiful Ohio and all that there is here. Yes.
Have you seen an uptake in
Yes.
people from outside of the United States coming to this now?
Yeah, it's interesting. So this just happened in September, and what we learned from other US World Heritage sites was that the inquiries from overseas come in fast, but it takes people a while for trip planning. But an interesting phenomenon was at least a couple of our sites, just the week that World Heritage happened, the inscription happened, they had out-of-country visitors who came to visit, and they said, we're here because we heard it was added to the World Heritage List, and we were in the US anyway, and so we wanted to see it while we were here. Yeah. So yes, yeah. And the visitation, you know, it's been so recent, and over the winter our visitation always dips, but it is gangbusters at these sites right now. So many people want to see them, which is really great. And I just encourage you all to come, and you can visit our website, hopewellearthworks.org. There's visit information and more information about the sites. And then this is, you know, sort of our logo, which I show because it was actually a real collaborative effort with tribal partners, with Ohio History Connection, with the National Park Service, and we tried to encapsulate something that would, you know, they connect the water, the earth, and the sky with the earthworks, and just a very simple logo. So the logo was more work than you might imagine. The Park Service they're wonderful, wonderful partners. They have a lot of rules about logo use and so on. So. And then this, we're back to the beginning because it's really ultimately about people and relationships and doing something great together. So we sort of feel like that's what we're doing today, and it's a reflection on what happened here so long ago. And I would, if we have any time left, because you guys asked such great questions along the way, I'd be happy to take any more questions that you have. So yes.
In maintaining sites,
Mm-hmm.
you've got a tree growing out of one of them.
Yeah.
Make an effort to remove that?
Oh, yes. We do. Now, Fort Ancient, with 3.5 miles of walls in a wooded area, we're never going to get all the trees off of it, but we are really trying to increase certain species of trees are especially damaging, because if you know anything about trees, some trees, if they break, they're going to snap in half, and some trees, if they're going to go over. And those are the ones that really destroy the earthworks. So really working on trying to be proactive about trees that look like they're about to go over. So we would love to clear more, and that's a big long-term goal. And if anybody has $10 million, I could probably do it tomorrow. But yeah, it's a great question because it's important for the preservation, not just so people can see them. But yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Ohio History Connection is a 501c3. We have a foundation arm. You can, thank you for the question, because you can donate. There are envelopes in the back of the room. Yeah, I know. Thank you. It is really important. You know, we get a decent chunk of our funding from the state, and the state, you know, they do their best. I'll tell you, with 59 sites, the maintenance never ends. It's like you hear about deferred maintenance with a park service or your local park system. Probably, we have a ton of deferred maintenance, and we just try to prioritize. But every donation that goes into our World Heritage funds, we either put into caring for the sites or into programming. So if you feel so moved to make a donation, we really appreciate that. We also appreciate you telling your, you know, talking to your legislators and saying these are places you care about. Especially, they hear a lot from folks in southern and central Ohio about the earthworks, but for legislators in northern Ohio to know too that, hey, these places really matter, that is always helpful. So yeah, thank you. Okay, any other questions? You have been incredibly patient with me. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your attention and your great questions. Thanks.